and welcome to anyone new to the channel or to my podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners, and there may be graphic and violent content, so listener discretion is advised. Now, I first watched a documentary on this serial killer. I think it was either last year or the year before. I can't quite remember, but it was really interesting. So I've been wanting to do a podcast on him for a little while. You can see in the background of our video now that we've got a map of the USA. I've added stickers to the states that we've already discussed. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to track, and it also lets my viewers know how many states we've done so far. But our state today is New York, and that's why I'm wearing my Snoopy New York t-shirt. So that's a little bit of a giveaway before I even announce it, guys. But this whole area of the US, right? So New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, I've got the best memories of traveling in my teenage years with my mum. I made several snarky remarks, so I do apologize, Mum, that my teenage years I was a little bit angsty. But it's just one of the prettiest areas from what I remember. So our serial killer today is Joel Rifkin, and he was one of New York's most notorious serial killers. If you do feel like watching a really good documentary on today's serial killer, I do have a really good suggestion. It's called Rifkin on Rifkin, Confessions of a Serial Killer. It's available in the US on Oxygen, I believe it's called, and in Australia it's available on Haiyu. Drop a comment in the comment section below if you want some more info on my research, the documentaries that I watch. Feel free to ask me. I'm happy to share how I get all my info and everything that I really do as a part of my research for these podcasts. Now, today's serial killer, Joel, he's really quite interesting because he really did look quite unassuming, which again, I think is why victims felt so comfortable and were partial to go with him. Once again, our victims are sex workers, and little was done to stop this serial killer at the time as well. The police really did get quite lucky with Joel. It could have been a lot worse, not that it was not horrible. There are 17 victims that we know of, but it definitely could have been a lot worse considering his escalation at the time. But Rifkin, he didn't have the easiest of lives. But we're going to start where we always start at my podcast, and we're going to start in his childhood. He was born on January 20th, 1959. He was given up for adoption. His biological parents were still in college, and they really weren't ready for marriage and starting a family and all those things that come with the responsibilities of having a baby. But a couple who were childless at the time, they would adopt him when he was only 3 weeks old, and his parents were Bernard and Jeanne Rifkin. 3 years after adopting Joel, they actually adopted a little girl as well and had a daughter, and then they would move to a little town called East Meadow in Long Island. Now, whilst we don't have too much of what his home life was like, I certainly have a lot of his childhood experiences in school and what possibly led to him becoming a serial killer. So it appears as though right from get-go at school that he was a real target for those bullies. There was just something about him that would draw them to him. I don't know how things like this happen, but they really do. Again, I'm not just going to justify what bullies do, but they do seem to have a target in mind and they just go after it. And bullies are everywhere, right? They're in every facet of our life. It doesn't matter whether it's school or work. You do experience them in every facet. They would even give him a nickname, the Turtle. And the reason that they would name him this was because he had a slouch and he walked slow. Because no one known to man in elementary school or primary school was slow and slouched a little bit. He would disappoint his father academically. His IQ was 128, but the school system failed to actually diagnose him as dyslexic. So his father would really often yell at him. He couldn't understand why he wasn't doing well. He was a real failure in his father's eyes. And he would treat him very similar to the way the bullies would at school. So not only did he have bullies at school, but he had a bully at home. So it was really difficult for him. But his mum, on the other hand, was like the complete opposite. She was really different, and they would share a love of photography and also gardening, something that he would take through all of his life, his love of gardening. But things really didn't seem to get better in high school either. He was what I would depict in those movies as a typical nerd. His grades certainly didn't reflect that, by the way, guys. He would wear glasses. He'd wear those high-waisted pants where you could see the socks and it's just a little just nerdy. But he would attempt to fit in, especially by joining the track team. Now, that would just lead to more name calling and having his head flushed down a toilet, which, by the way, guys, I thought that was just a thing in movies. I didn't realize that that actually happens in real life. He would even try and placate his bullies, and he'd invite them round to his house to drink beer. But what they would really do is they just use him for the free beer. So when that failed, and he failed to make those friends in the track team, he would end up joining the yearbook committee. He would work all year round and taking photos and contributing really well, all to be excluded at the end of year wrap party and have his camera stolen. And both things really hurt him immensely, and it caused him a lot of humiliation. Now, he would eventually graduate in 1977, but I'd actually like to make a little bit of commentary there, right? Imagine all of that humiliation you felt fundamentally for 12 to 13 years with your peers. So he's got all of this built up anger, and he's got all of these fantasies on how he's going to get his revenge on these people and what he's going to do to them, and especially the women, because he really didn't have very good experiences with women as well at school. So he was having all these violent fantasies on what he wanted to do as a part of his revenge. And this is all building up inside a boy that's not even 18 yet. So you can just imagine that was just absolutely horrible for him. Now, he would attend the community college in Long Island. He really didn't settle in there, as he'd only complete one course over a year. He would then attempt college again at the State University in Brockport. He really seemingly wasn't enjoying this college experience. But during this time, he would have his only relationship, but it didn't go anywhere. She would say, though, that Joel was really sweet, but he always seemed really depressed. He would attempt college at the community college again, but in the end, he'd give up college altogether. After about 4 years, he'd only earn himself 12 credits. So he didn't seem to really enjoy it. He didn't get into it. He wasn't invited to parties. So it was I think it felt a bit like high school all over again. And I think because he hadn't been diagnosed with dyslexia yet, it was just really hard for him. He knew that he understood this, but he couldn't comprehend it. So I imagine that frustration. So imagine all of this frustration, right? This is just building and building and building. So throughout the 1980s, he worked a series of odd jobs around Long Island, but he wouldn't stay in them very long. Apparently, he had some poor hygiene, he was always absent, and he just had a general inaptitude for any advancement in any type of career. And it was even noted by one of the local music stores that he worked with that he was a real piece of work. He couldn't even count to 10. Now, again, guys, I don't think it's because he lacked the intelligence, right? But in February 1987, his father was chronically ill. He was a really heavy smoker. He'd been diagnosed with emphysema. And then in 1986, his father had actually been diagnosed with prostate cancer. And following all the treatments and stuff like that, his father would end up taking a massive dose of pills, and he'd die 4 days later after being in a coma. Apparently, Joel would deliver a eulogy at his funeral, and he would move everybody to tears. But his depression would just absolutely get 1,000 times worse. So about 6 months after his dad had passed away, he'd be arrested in Hampstead, Long Island, for soliciting a prostitute. He'd pay a fine, and he managed to keep it hidden from his mum. But when he did feel the urge to use sex workers, he would use them in Manhattan so that he couldn't be caught in the general area where his mum was. So on the side, though, he began collecting books and press killings on serial killers of sex workers. In particular, he picked up on the Green River killings, and apparently there was also another New York serial killer by the name of Arthur Shawcross. But somewhere along the way, it moved from reading about them to actually killing them himself. But after years of feeling like he wasn't enough and the constant bullying, and I think as well as the death of his dad, I think it was just his breaking point, right? A snapping point, whichever way you want to really put it. But I haven't done a podcast like this in a long time where we've gone into too much depth with the murders. This one, we're actually going to get a little bit into the murders because I was able to get a little bit more information. He gave some really well documented confessions. So I do have a little bit of information on the victims, and what we'll do at the end of me talking about the murders and how he got caught, we'll just go through the list of victims. It may be a little bit repetitive, but you'll get the general gist of it. But Joel would end up being convicted of 9 of his 17 victims, and we will go through what I have been able to find. There's about 3 or 4, or I think it's about 5 of the victims I was able to get some actual information on, but otherwise it'll just be their manner of death and the order in which he killed them. So according to Joel, he actually planned his first murder. He'd move in and out of his parents' home, depending on his money situation and his job situation. So in March 1989, he was living with his mum. He would admit at this time, though, that his violent fantasies were getting more and more intense. It's a story that I'm becoming really familiar with now. Something would just snap inside Joel, and it would lead to a murder of 17 women. He would choose the month of March in particular, though, because his mum she was away, so he would need to be alone for what he was about to do. So he would cruise around Manhattan's East Village and he'd be looking for a village. Later on, when he was caught and confessing, Joel would actually only remember his first victim as being called Susie. We will come back to that, by the way, why he referred to her as Susie, but her real name would be Heidi Belch. Now, they'd make a stop for drugs before going back to Long Island, where he lived with his mum. Now, shortly after having sex, Heidi would actually say that she wanted more drugs. If she was going to continue, servicing him, she wanted more drugs. And this is where his urge to murder just really took over. He began beating her, and when he thought he had actually killed her, she'd start to fight back, which would lead him to strangling her to death. Now, he would clean up the living room, making sure there was no signs of a struggle or murder, and he would promptly go to sleep for several hours, as though nothing had happened. I don't quite know how you can go to sleep after you've murdered someone, but apparently he slept quite soundly. When he did get up, he would take Heidi's body down to the basement, and this is where he would dismember her. To make sure that she couldn't be identified, he would remove her fingertips and he'd pull her teeth out. He would place her head in an old paint can, and he would place her body parts in various areas. One in particular would be near the woods in Hopewell and the East River. Her head would be found by a golfer a few days later at the Hopewell Valley Golf Club. That golfer had one hell of a day in finding that. Her murder, that would actually remain unsolved until his confession. But it would be another year before Joel would murder again. It's unknown exactly when he murdered Julie because, unfortunately for her family, her remains have never been found. He would say that he picked her up, Julie Blackbird, because she had a similar look to Madonna. I'm so sorry, I've got little kittens again scratching at the door, demanding to get in. They will not be getting in. Now, his mum would be away once again. She'd spend the night, and the next morning he would say he just lost control. Now, he would start beating her with one of the table legs. He wouldn't kill her this way. He would strangle her. This seems to be his MO, by the way, strangulation. Joel, during his confession, would admit that he had contemplated having sex with her corpse to emulate Ted Bundy, but the thought repulsed him too much. Now, who knew that a serial killer had a line that he wouldn't cross? But this was a line he really wouldn't cross. It repulsed him, the thought of doing that. Now, seeing as the last time the body had been found, he would dispose of the body just a little bit differently this time. He'd bought cement to assist with weighing down the body parts in the East River and the Brooklyn Barge Canal. Now, as I said before, because of this, her remains have never been found. And the only reason that her death is known is because of Joel's confession. It would be during this murder in particular that he'd sort of start collecting souvenirs. I am just going to pause there, guys, and just have a little bit of a sip of my tea. If you ever want to know what tea I'm drinking, it's French Earl Grey. I absolutely love French Earl Grey. Now, Over the next 3 years, he would terrorise the women in the sex worker industry. Barbara Jacobs would be our next victim. Now, he would pick her up in about July 1991. She would be another one that would go to his house, never to be seen again. She'd be beaten with the same table leg that he'd used on Julie. Her death would also end in strangulation. But this is the part where he changed the disposal method. He said he didn't really enjoy dismembering body parts, so he decided to change that. So he would wrap Barbara's body in plastic and place her in a cardboard box and drop her near a cement plant near the Hudson River. Now, she would be found a couple of hours or a few hours later, but only be identified when he confessed. Mary Ellen DeLuca, she would also go missing in 1991, but he would find her in Queens, and they'd end up in a motel. Now, he said that she complained the whole time that she was servicing him, and then he stopped and he asked her if she wanted to die, and her reply shocked him because she said yes. She'd be strangled as well, and Joel would only remember her because he thought of her as one of the weird ones. I'm guessing that's because she wanted to die. She wanted to no longer exist. But he'd gotten himself into a little bit of a situation with the body. But he would go and leave the room and he would purchase himself a steamer trunk. Now, he would place her body in that to transport her, but he would place her body at a rest stop. Now, she'd be found nude except for her bra, but she was another victim that wouldn't be identified until his arrest. He was becoming a little more erratic over time. He was using sex workers on a daily basis, and he was only driven to kill on a whim. He himself would even say he couldn't predict when he was going to lose control and murder someone. But in September 1991, he'd pick up 31-year-old Yun Lee. He had actually used her services before, so she would be the first victim that he knew before he actually killed her. Now, after strangling her, he felt a hint of remorse, but obviously not enough because he'd continue killing women, but he felt a touch of remorse. But he would use the same trunk that he'd used to transport Mary Ellen's body, and he would dispose of Yun Lee in the East River. Now, thankfully, when she was found, she had an ex-husband that was able to identify her, so she wouldn't be known as an unknown victim until his arrest. So at least her family got to bury her, and, whilst her murder wasn't solved, she wasn't lying unidentified. Now, our next victim would be Jane Doe number 1. She's yet to be identified, but he would recall the details of her murder, but not her name. He would say that during his confession that he picked her up in Manhattan, he strangled her, and he dumped her body in the East River. This time he used an oil drum to dispose of the body. However, during this disposal, he would be confronted by 2 patrolmen about illegal dumping, but he would claim that he'd been collecting junk around the area, so he was let go with a warning and a fine. Another missed opportunity by the police, but I doubt you'd really think that when you caught someone dumping something, that it would be a body. So you can't really, let's be honest. And you can understand why he wasn't caught. Now, he would purchase more oil drums as he found this a really good way to dispose of the bodies. He would use one on Lorraine Orvito. Now, she was just 28 years old and she was strangled as well. He kept souvenirs from this victim. This would include her jewelry and also her driver's license. Her body would be stuffed into an oil drum and she would be dropped in the Coney Island Creek. A really, really sad component of this murder would be that she would be found 2 months before her family had reported her missing. So imagine that. You only get identified 2 months after your body has been found. It's that long. We do find out why, but it's very, very sad. A week after killing Lorraine, though, his oldest victim, a 39-year-old by the name of Mary Ann Holloman, she would die the same way as the other victims. She'd be strangled. She'd also be disposed of in Coney Island Creek, and the police would be tipped off to her remains in July 1992. Her remains would be found before Lorraine, 2 days before Lorraine's, and she'd be identified through her dental records. But given the fact that two bodies were found in the same vicinity, it did definitely suggest a serial killer. But during this particular time in New York, there were up to 2,000 murders a year. So that's a lot for the homicide department. So unfortunately, once again, we're seeing that missing and murdered sex workers were not a high list of priorities. Had they been, maybe it would have prevented more murders. However, during this time in New York, 2,000 murders, that's a lot to cover, right? You've got 365 days in the year. Let's not even do the calculations, but that's a lot. So I don't blame, or even blame's the wrong word. I understand why the police were unable to sort of identify that a serial killer was running in their midst. Now, Joel's ninth victim, she'd be Jane Doe number 2, and she would be found before Marianne and Lorraine. But Joel would claim he didn't remember her name, but he was able to remember her tattoos. He would dispose of her body in the Brooklyn Newtown Creek, and she was spotted because a foot was visible from that oil drum. But over the Mother's Day weekend in May 1992, Iris Sanchez, she would go with Joel and not be found until June 1993. He actually drew a map of her location during his confession. So that's how she was found. Now, it would be near the Rockaway Boulevard, and her body had been wedged underneath a mattress. He would keep her watch and her jewelry. Anna Lopez would be next. She'd been picked up over Memorial Day weekend, so that's about the end of May. After he strangled her in his car, he would dump her body off the I-84. Now, a motorist only found her the next day, but an earring of hers would be found later in his bedroom. Violet O'Neill, now she'd be taken back to his house. It's been almost a year since he's brought anyone back to his house, I might add. And he would dismember her and dispose of her remains in various places. The only parts of her remains would be discovered. He obviously got over his not wanting dismembered victims because he did dismember her. We've got Mary Catherine Williams was another victim that he'd actually been with before. So clearly he'd gotten over again the remorse of killing someone he knew. She would be smothered in his mum's car, and she would be another victim that would be unknown until his confession. But he would take souvenirs from her murder as well. Jenny Soto, she would be the last victim in 1992, and she was a real fighter. She clawed, she fought, she did everything within her power to fight this man. She'd break 10 of her fingernails. Now, he would keep her bra, her panties, her ID, and earrings as trophies. I'm guessing that was a real win for him and a real trophy win. Now, she was identified the following day because her fingerprints had been in the database because she'd been previously arrested. Now, he wouldn't commit another murder for another 4 months, and I think Jenny Soto scared him a little because she was a real fighter. So I think he was worried about getting caught at this stage. But he'd killed 3 more people before he was caught. Now, the first victim of 1993, she'd be Leah Evans, and she'd be strangled as well. However, she would be the only victim that would be buried in a grave, in a shallow grave. She'd be found by hikers, and her ID would actually be found in Joel's home. Lauren Marquez, now she'd been working on 2nd Avenue when he would pick her up. She almost got away because a man walked past and it temporarily frightened him a little bit. Now, she would die, she would still die, but this time she would die of a broken neck. Now, it seemed this murder was a little bit more frenzied because she had some broken ribs and she had signs of a beating. So I'm guessing the man walking past really did frighten him, so I think it became a little bit more frenzied. Now, in June 1993, Joel Rifkin would kill his final victim, Tiffany Brascani. Now, this murder would lead to his arrest. She, after he murdered her, would be wrapped in tarp and placed in the boot of his mum's car. This is the most appalling thing that it's just appalling. His mum would actually take the body with her when she went and ran errands because he returned home and she needed his car. Now, once his mum returned from those errands, he'd remove Tiffany and he'd place her in his pickup truck 4 days after her murder. This is where he's going to attempt to dispose of her body. And this is where things went terribly wrong for him. I'm just going to take a sip of my drink. On June 28th, 1993, at around 3 a.m., two state troopers could have never known what they were just about to encounter. They would see a pickup that was missing its license plates. So they'd attempted to get the driver to stop, and he would just speed off. After about 20 minutes of a chase involving, I think it was 3 or 4 more state troopers, the truck would actually crash into a telephone pole. Now, once they got near that truck, the police would smell a really foul odour that had been permeating from it. They also didn't really understand why a driver had sped off, given that it was a minor traffic infraction, and it would really lead just to like a ticket. So that things would all come to light when the police would peel back the tarp and they'd see a dead woman. The police would then take him back to the station, and I think it was about 8 hours. They would question him and they would listen to Joel confess to 17 murders. Now, for some unknown reason, this confession has never been recorded. He described all 17 murders without a lawyer being present. He'd write the names that he remembered. He would sketch maps to help the police find the victims that were still missing. He was really dispassionate and really factual, and he would often refer to, during his confession, the events as incidences or, nothing really. And he'd list his victims by numbers. He never really gave them names or anything like that. So he was already of that. No empathy, just really cold. So the police were already shocked at that. Now, it was nearly 8 p.m. when the police would present the the search warrant, to Joel Rifkin. They would scour through this 2-story house for evidence. Now, this would turn out to be a trove of evidence here, right? When they left about 6 hours later, they would have over 200 items that would link Joel to, a 4-year murder spree, we'll call it. Now, his upstairs bedroom, that would yield about 75 pieces of women's jewellery, photographs that he'd taken of several unidentified women. There would be various women's clothing, there'd be makeup cases, there'd be curling irons, there'd be wallets, pocketbooks, and a mixture of IDs. One driver's license in particular belonged to Mary DeLuca. Now, she'd been found dead in October 1991, and another one would belong to Jenny Soto, the one who put up a real fight. She'd been found in November 1992. His bedroom actually also contained a lot of books on the Green River Killer and newspaper clippings of the serial killer in New York at the time, who was Arthur Shawcross. So I think it made way for, we know exactly who we've caught. Now, in the garage, they would follow a smell that was reeking from the general area. The wheelbarrow that they saw in there, that had human blood in it, and a pair of women's panties would be lying on the floor. There would be a stockpile of rope and tarp, disposal methods, and a chainsaw that was in the garage would be stained with blood and bits of human flesh. Now, the neighbours had actually complained that the smell permeating from the garage was really quite disgusting, but they just put it down to the fact that it was just like a fertiliser smell or manure smell. I'm guessing that's really what you would automatically assume. That's not your go-to. You're not going to automatically think, oh yeah, there's body parts inside, that garage. Someone's chopping up and hacking up bodies. Sorry, that was a terrible way to put that, but that's the only way I can really, put it. But here's what I've been able to find out about the victims, and we're just going to go in order now of how the victims were murdered. Even though I've gone through it before, it's just to give you guys a proper timeline. We've got Heidi Belch. Now, she was believed to be his first victim, and he would tell investigators that he'd driven to New York City in 1989 to pick up a prostitute by the name of Susie. So he took out all of his rage on her and all those violent fantasies that he'd been harboring for about 10 years. And he would strangle her to death. And we talked about this before, that her head had actually been found at the golf club. Now, it would be almost 25 years before investigators were able to positively identify her. She used various names and social security numbers. Now, in 2013, they discovered that her aunt had actually listed her as missing, and that she went by the name Susan Spencer. So that's why he thought her name was Susie, because that was her alias that she'd been using when she was a sex worker. Now, she was positively identified through DNA. Then we've got Julie Blackbird. Now, apparently it was about 16 months after the murder of Heidi. So he, as you're aware, I talked about it before, that she was beaten with a table leg and then he was strangled. He would say that he put her in various buckets filled with concrete and dropped her into the East River and the Brooklyn Canal. I think, and I'm making a huge assumption here, I think that's why she's possibly never been found, because there's concrete with her body parts. So it would be terribly hard. I do hope that one day her body parts are found so that her family can give her a proper burial. Then we've got Barbara Jacobs. She was the one that was stuffed inside a plastic bag and into a cardboard box and thrown into the Hudson River. Then we've got Mary Ellen DeLuca. She allegedly complained about having sex with him, and that's what led to all his rage, and that's why she was killed. I'm guessing, look, he had poor hygiene. These women, you could only imagine the life they've already got, and then to experience that. So it's just appalling. Then you've got Yun Lee. She was strangled to death in September 1991. Her body was found in the East River and her ex-husband identified her. Then we've got Jane Doe number 1. We do not have any further information on her. The only thing that I can genuinely hope for is, given our time, the times we live in now, that she will be identified the same way that Heidi was identified, through DNA. You've got Lorraine Orvito. Her mother, Florence, would tell the New York Times that she'd been saving Christmas presents for the 2 years until she learned in 1993 that her daughter had died. So she was waiting for her daughter to come home. So that's just really heartbreaking for me to know that she had a mum who was waiting for her to come home. You've got Mary Ann Holloman. Her body had been found near Coney Island Creek. And then we've got Jane Doe number 2. I don't have any further information. She does have tattoos, and hopefully through those tattoos and hopefully through DNA, she can get identified, and her family can genuinely get some real closure and some real goodbyes and some answers. Then we've got Iris Sanchez. He would place her body under that mattress and put it at the illegal dump site. So that was the one where the patrolman almost caught him, and he'd been just let go with a warning and also the fine. Then we've got Anna Lopez. She'd be found in a wooded area off Interstate 84. So I'm so sorry that I'm going through all of the victims and making sure that, I just want them to be heard. But her mother would actually tell the newspaper that her daughter was a happy and an outspoken child, and she struggled with drug abuse, and that's how she began her life as a prostitute. She vowed at the time to be present in the courtroom to make sure that Joel and others knew that the victims had been more than just sex workers. I want to get all of these families together, and I want everybody to be there in court with me. I want to show these girls, these prostitutes have families who care, and they were probably alone on the streets, but not in the world. I think that is so admirable for someone to stand up and give these victims a face and a name and make sure that they aren't just known as sex workers. So I find that really, really admirable. Then we've got Violet O'Neill. She had been found in multiple waterways at the Harlem River, the East River, but her mother, Victoria O'Neill, she would say that she'd last seen her daughter about 2 weeks before she was found. She was also the mother of a young son, and he'd been staying with his grandmother when his mum had actually disappeared. So what she said about her daughter was, "My daughter was a very beautiful girl. The only thing that makes me feel a little bit better is to think that perhaps she didn't die in pain." I can only hope that Violet didn't die in any pain, because I wouldn't want that to be the last memory that she would have while going out of this world. I would hope it would have been her son, would have been her last memory. We've got Mary Catherine Williams. Now, she had been linked to him at the time of his confession because they found her credit cards amongst his belongings. So her mother, Doris Williams, described her daughter as a struggling actress and a former high school homecoming queen who'd moved to New York City from her home in Charlotte, North Carolina. So she went to the university in Chapel Hill. She was a cheerleader there. She was really happy. She got married. After the divorce, she just spiraled out of control. She wanted to become an actress. She just went into a seedier part of this world, right? I don't know completely the story itself, but she really struggled with an addiction to crack cocaine after her marriage broke down, and she would turn to prostitution basically to fund that and support that habit. So it's really quite sad, because she seemed to have quite a promising future when she was in university. And then you've got Jenny Soto, the one who was a fighter. She was a real fighter. She actually had pieces of skin under her fingernails. So even though she'd broken her fingernails, what was left of her broken fingernails, there was bits of skin. So her sister, Margarita, would say that she had fake nails and those were ripped off when she fought him. But underneath her real nails, she had that skin. Now, her family would describe Jenny as a quiet Brooklyn girl who loved to play with her nieces and nephews, and she just had a little bit of a wilder side whenever she went into the city. So they were out every night. She loved the clubs. She loved getting dressed up. She was just an outgoing girl. She had a past record for prostitution, but apparently, according to her family, she actually had been trying to put her life together before she was killed. And her family, and her sister specifically, actually said she wasn't what they said she was. So maybe she wasn't a sex worker at the time. I don't know. I don't want to make any presumptions, but maybe she was trying to get her life together, and maybe he just picked her up at a wrong time. Then we've got Leah Evans, and she'd been discovered by a family that had been hunting for dandelions. She was a daughter of a civil court judge, and she had actually attended Sarah Lawrence, which is insane, right? Like, again, these girls, they sound like they've had such beautiful and promising futures. Not to say, by the way, guys, that they weren't beautiful people. Then we've got Lauren Marquez. Now, she was the mother of 2 children. So very, very sad for her 2 children. Then we've got the saving grace of Tiffany Briscani. She had moved to New York from her home in Louisiana. She was pursuing her dream of becoming an actress or a singer, but she developed an addiction to drugs as well, and that derailed part of her dream, and it would influence the fact that she entered the world of sex workers. She also began it fairly innocently because she did start out as a topless dancer. So jury selection for Joel's first trial, that would be the murder of Tiffany. That would begin on April 11th in 1994. Now, a jury panel of 7 men and 5 women were seated about 9 days later. So opening arguments would begin on April 20th. Now, the Assistant District Attorney, Fred Klein, he described Joel as a sexual sadist who relished his victims' suffering. Here is a direct quote from the trial. He got caught red-handed and now he's using and abusing the concept of mental illness. Joel's attorney, though, John Lawrence, he called his client a paranoid schizophrenic who lived in the twilight zone, overwhelmed by violent, irresistible compulsions that would take control of his life. Again, this is appalling that I have to say this out loud. Joel, for his part, snored his way through the prosecution's case. Now, his lawyer would say that it was allergies on the sandwiches that he would eat in jail. Now, the Long Island psychiatrist Barbara Kerwin, she deemed Joel's psychological test results as the most pathological she had seen in the past 20 years. But appearing for the state would be Dr. Park Diaz. Now, he'd been a prosecution witness against Jeffrey Dahmer and also John Hinckley. Now, Dr. Park would find that Joel was sick but not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing and he did it. So the jurors would end up agreeing with the psychiatrist. They would deliberate briefly on May 9th and they'd convict him of murder and reckless endangerment. That was for leading the police car chase. The judge would give Joel 25 years to life for murder, plus 2 1/3 to 7 years for the charge of reckless endangerment. Now, even before he was sentenced, he'd been transferred to the Suffolk County, and that was because he was pending the trial for the murders of Leah Evans and Lauren Marquez. There would be a suppression hearing that would try and squash his confession, but that would fail. They weren't able to take that out because he would end up pleading guilty on both counts and he would receive 2 more consecutive terms of 25 years to life. Now, in November, he would plead guilty to Iris Sanchez and also to 3 more counts in Brooklyn who were the victims, Laura Ovita, Mary Ann Holloman, and the Jane Doe number 2. But by January 1996, he was scheduled to serve 183 years for 7 murders, with 10 counts of murder pending. Now, there would only be a further 2 murder convictions. I don't know who those victims were and who those convictions aligned to, but there was 9 convictions of murder, but there were 17 victims. So he got sentenced to 183 years for 9 murders. In 2002, New York Supreme Court rejected his appeal for his convictions and for the murder of those 9 women. His lawyer, argued that the statements to the police at the time of his arrest should have been suppressed because he'd not been informed of his rights. He still sits in jail today, by the way, guys. Look, for me personally, I think there is a little bit of I'm not sure what went on. I think that unfortunately the police might have done something a little bit wrong. He has held pretty firm that he asked for a lawyer and that they didn't give it to him, that he had to keep confessing until they knew of all of these murders. So I think it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, but mate, all those victims, you murdered them. So you deserve to be sitting in jail, and you deserve a lot worse. So it needs to be about the victims. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening to episode 17. If you like this podcast, please hit that like button, but subscribe. Go and listen to the other episodes if you haven't had a chance to yet. But have a great weekend, my fellow peanuts. I hope you all have a fabulous one. See ya.